Um, so how many people we have? Like four of us here, and or people like online. So welcome everyone to the fortnightly CFRC seminar. I would like to acknowledge the Aboriginal people that are traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today. Today we have our first guest lecture of the series from Professor David Sanderson. Professor Sanderson needs no introduction in the field of development, disasters and emergencies. He has more than 30 years of experience in the field, working with institutions such as Care International UK, Oxford Brookes University, Howard University, Norwegian University of Science and Technology. He has been here with us in UNSW since 2016 as inaugural Judith Nelson Chair for Architecture. Looking forward to the talk on 10 takeaways for urban disaster recovery, and over to you.
Great, thank you very much, and it's very nice to be here. Very nice to be with such an intimate group, actually. It feels great, and thank you very, I keep saying that way. Thank you very much for being here online. I assume you can hear us okay. That's all good. Please, at any time, just jump in, and I have no urge. I have to get through my slides, and, push through and bore everybody to death, which I may well do anyway. But I've prepared about 35 minutes, something like that, not an hour, to give time for conversation, anything Q&A. It's mostly photos, it's images. This photograph actually is from Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. It took place in 2013, and it's about 3 months after the really bad typhoon. The 25th that year was registering that size. One of the big ships there was lifted up, landed there. And the point of the story here is people getting on with life several months after. People seeing these things, getting on. There's a little shop there, there's a bar next door, people's washing. And that's the story, people surviving and getting on with it. I'm not romanticizing, people have need, obviously, after disasters. Of course they do, obviously. But it's not helpless victims, it's people surviving and getting on. And the takeaway, if anything, I could stop right now, is listen to what people actually want and do and say and think and feel and need. Actually, I could stop right now. Should I stop right now? Have we done this? That's it. Dignity and respect. I'm going to take these 10 takeaways from this piece of work, and every time I put it up, and I've said this before, it feels like therapy. Once you talk about doing something like this, it was all kinds of disasters, including conflict and violence, a disaster, I don't know if that is a disaster, climate change, and urban, which is over half the world, as we know, and growing. And then trying to say something useful with a review team of 18 people, going to 5 drafts, and those who have worked and had to do reviews. I can feel that pain, so I would very like to give these away to anybody who wants them. It's available online. It was a piece of work commissioned by the Overseas Development Institute and ALNAP, a UK-based think tank. It had to be done the day before Brexit took place because it's funded by Europe. So there's the hardest deadline you've ever seen to finish the day before Brexit. So it was a 9-month job. It runs to about 250 pages. And these are the phases in 4 parts: the context, the city, secondly, themes and issues, coordination, corruption, thirdly, tools and approaches. That follows project cycle management of humanitarian response and recovery, and then fourthly, what are called sectors, the global cluster. I'm losing my words, I'm so sorry. The global cluster system, which is organized into sectors, and I'll touch on that in a moment. So trying to meet agencies where they are right now and trying to say something useful. It came out the second half of 2019, so it's not too out of date, but give it another 10 minutes and I'm sure it will be. But why now? I'm putting that there to prompt myself. Why at that time? Really in the last 10 years, I mean, obviously open disasters have been around forever. World War II was a total tragedy for an awful lot of cities around the world. You got that? Great. But really since the Haiti earthquake, I think it's fairish to say an awful lot of humanitarian actors got more sort of waking up to the idea of disasters in towns and cities. And I'm going to unpack this in a second, but really why now? 3 things: rapid urban growth, which won't be lost on anybody, I'm sure, on this call in here right now, an increase in urban crises, and an aid system built on rural response. So I'm going to very quickly talk about that. I'm going to move quite quickly. I hope not too quickly. You'll stop me if I get carried away. English okay? Okay, urban game change. We realize city growth it's about 1.4 million people a week. I mean, beyond belief, 1.4 million people a week, but it is. About 10 years ago, we became more urban than rural. The red dotted line is the world shooting up urban-wise. rural declining. We could get into a discussion that actually everything is urban. There's no such thing as a rural-urban difference, and the book does acknowledge that and talk about it a bit, but I'm going to assume that there's a difference in rural areas. This at the bottom, for those who know Johannesburg, is the Yitskei River a few years ago. An awful lot of people living in low-income settlements. And I just want to touch on that just shy of 1 billion people live in low-income settlements around the world. And the thing that always gets me with this image here is just the note at the bottom. The numbers in the circles are in millions. It's 500 million people in sub-Saharan Africa by 2025, probably. 500 million people, almost exactly the same number, floating somewhere over India here, and you can see around there, and so on and so forth. Latin America is largely urbanized. That's why that figure is relatively low. It's near 197 million people by 2025. So the only reason I mention this is that poorer people are more vulnerable, and when disasters strike, you're knocked down quicker and it's harder to recover. And so there is a straight correlation, no surprise to anybody, between poverty, vulnerability, and crises. Not always. Rich people get it too in disasters, but large swathes of people we often don't think about. What does it look like? Well, two worlds in one. The image on the right is Qatar by Jean Nouvel. Just wonder what you think of his building. It glows red at night. I'm not kidding, I've seen it as my photo. I watched it going dark. Up here is Myanmar. Down there is Dhaka.
It looks like it's superimposed. Is that like an image of the building today, or is that?
That's about 5 years ago.
Okay, so it's actually.
Yes, no. It glows at the dark and nice and goes up and goes red. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so world of architecture. I trained as an architect, I should say, but 30 years ago, I started getting involved in this side of the story, and this has been my world, if you like, but from a position of privilege, coming and going. So yes, poverty, vulnerability, crises. Second one, an increase in urban crises. These are the takeaways, by the way. I'll tell you what these sketches are at the end. An increase in urban crises, naturally triggered disasters are on the increase. Climate change is upon us. I'll touch on that a bit later. Conflict went down actually a few years ago, but it's gone right up, especially since 2014-15. And forced migration is the biggest in recorded history. We used to say a few years ago, the biggest since World War II. It's now the biggest in recorded history. So, we're facing a time of stuff that's happening, and tragically, we've all been through coronavirus, and maybe are more aware of those things, that actually we can get knocked over. So I'm not going to dwell on this a lot, but just the point, it's a graph of things going upwards. Floods and storms and heat waves. Obviously, climate change is a big bit of that story. This is a tsunami, an earthquake at sea that causes a wave that comes in. And this is Japan 10 years ago, almost to the week. And we're standing on a hill that's about the height of this ceiling, which is about, 3 meters? No, 3 meters, something like that, about 10 feet. And the man here is pointing to where we're standing, and you can see there is no urban area behind us anymore, because the wave that came in the speed of an aeroplane, unbelievable, came and destroyed this town of what is almost certainly the most prepared country on the planet. I mean, really, Japan gets the fact there are disasters every day happening in Japan is amazing because of the preparedness of a nation and the wealth and all those things and strong governance. But even the most prepared places can be really overridden by naturally triggered disasters. No such thing as a natural disaster, as we know. Displacement from conflict. This is a man in Jordan, and this is in fact a project for the Norwegian Refugee Council of housing Syrian refugees in buildings, then doing those buildings up, as opposed to living in a tent. And most people do live in cities around the world. Globally, it's thought to be about 60%, as high as 90% in Jordan. Most people are in cities, so an awful lot of people moving around the world, biggest in recorded history. But to keep up, this is where I want to develop it. Humanitarian response needs to urbanize as well. This is takeaway number 3, actually, in the thing. So we need to urbanize as well. We need to embrace the city, understand it's different. Push back if you think rural is the same as urban. There are a lot of people who do. It's not really very different. Deputy head of a huge NGO, I won't name it because we're online. No difference, forget it, no difference. Okay, so I would argue, and I'm slightly polarizing the discussion, but I think it's accurate. Well, if we think about the humanitarian system, the UN and NGOs and agencies and donors and all that kind of stuff, the ecosystem, pretty much since World War II, pretty much in its modern incarnation, hardly changed at all. Delivering sectorally stuff to people who need, rather to this rather beautiful village in northern Zimbabwe, or to Zatari refugee camp, where things are organized and planned, and you need external stuff. But this is the new reality, just another picture of Jordan, where there's complexity and there's difference. This is not the same thing. The system was built on the left-hand side, and this is a growing reality by 1.4 million people a week on the right-hand side. This is the cluster system. I don't want to get stuck in this, but 2004, 5 or 6, I think 2006, the system came in as a way to organize this humanitarian system according to the stuff you deliver. Education, sanitation, logistics, nutrition, shelter, protection, really important, food security. And it's very good. It's a lot better than what there was. I'm not going to take a pop at that. It's very helpful, but it doesn't really work in the city so much. And I can point to the evidence of those kinds of things. It's no surprise to anybody that the life of human beings in cities is complicated, multifaceted, multidimensional, multisectoral, and this is absolutely not that. This is based on a predictable model, if you like the camps on the bottom left or the village on the top left. It's a different thing. And cluster system 2.0 is the conversation about who's going to do that, what, and how. So just to unpack that a little bit. So what do we do? So that was setting the scene. I'm sorry, it's a bit gloomy, but there it is. So the rest of it is what are we going to do and how are we doing it? All right, just some stuff on that. So work with what cities have to offer. I'm going to state the obvious. I'm not just stating the obvious because actually that's really important. Don't push against. Don't bring stuff in, as with Haiti, or ship it from Oxfordshire, from the great big containers in Bicester, owned by Oxfam, when you can buy it in the city. Who would have thought? Buy stuff locally, hire locally, do stuff locally. Not a surprise to anybody, but the system is still and has been very organized around assuming there's nothing there, broadly speaking. But it's not like that. Cities are amazing. Cities have got all the stuff. It's got all this stuff: talent, markets, investment, creativity, wealth, innovation. A big word in the humanitarian space that came in about, it actually came in 2009, literally, and has grown in the last 10 years and been formalized. But really build on what cities have to offer, and there are lots of tools and approaches and skills that have been developed in the last few years about that. I'm not suggesting nobody has, because that's not the case. Systems, seeing cities as systems, there's been quite a lot of work on that. The classic story that you break a leg in an earthquake, there's the nurse or the triage or the doctor. But of course, if there's a hospital, there's the electricity, there's the ambulance, there's the road, there's the being paid by the accountants of the people working there, and all those kinds of things. So seeing cities as systems is really great as a clue. So if you're going to do a borehole on the edge of a city somewhere to get water, that may be okay. But actually, there's a sewage system and everything else and a water supply system to think about. I'm not saying try to fix that because it's too big to fix from the aid world. It's a national issue. But thinking about systems and also collaborations, it's all about all of this negotiating space and living together. And so the proposal from the thing is two things: systems and collaborations, in particular, as ways of seeing cities and how they work, and not being mired in the complexity and loss, but actually having some recognition that it's not as simple as one little thing and it's all okay. It's okay, so far so good. Okay, if anyone online wants to chip in, please don't hesitate. Then cash, this is the big thing in the last few years, a big thing, inspired by a book called Just Give People Cash. It's like good, that's true, about 30 years ago. And so this is just one monthly high-level panel a few years ago, in fact chaired by the same person who brought the cluster system in, actually, Jan Egeland, who's quite a superstar. The question should always be asked, why not cash, and if not now, when? So the default is, don't give people food, give people cash. So the World Food Programme's #1 strategy is give people money. It's not give people food. Good for them, because obviously it's super cheap to do from your phone. You can send money to 10 million people, all that kind of stuff, as opposed to shipping it. Is it perfect? Of course, it's absolutely not perfect, of course, but it's no less worse than other sectors and a lot better than most, because it gives you agency. Chris, am I going to give you $30 and you can do what you like with it because your daughter may be very ill, or here's your bag of grain, which actually you may well go sell in the market because you need the money for your daughter who's ill. And that's a story that happens all the time. So really good, a real innovation, and who knew cash in cities is a good idea. Totally the obvious. But this is really taken off. It's not perfect, but it's really good. There are worries about cash getting in the wrong hands on those things, and we could talk about that if we had more time on another day. And again, I'm not going to ask you to look at all this at all. In fact, I really don't. It's to do with shelterers. There is a sector, the shelter sector. Think shelter, you might think of a standalone single building. A lot of people seem to think of domes. I don't know why, but they do. Actually, there are all different sheltering options in cities. Okay, there are loads. Go stay with people, go in an apartment, go and rent, all these different things. Urban areas have options, so don't read it, but I'm just saying it's not just a shelter. And I just want to take a little divergence here in the next 2 slides on this. That should all just come up. The idea of being seduced by design. Sorry, I thought it was going to be one. Not my photo. This is Joseph Ashmore from IOM, who's got a whole website and this kind of thing. I don't know why domes. I mean, is there some kind of thinking you stack them? Don't know why. It's weird. There's a dome. This is India, Gujarat after the earthquake. For those who know, Gujarat. This is Nepal after the first of the 2 big earthquakes 5 years ago. If you're an architect, you get a lot of people sending you these things saying shipping containers are great. Well, they're kind of nice if you spend a huge amount of money on them to make them useful, at which point it's a waste of money. A couple of us 3 years ago now were editors of this, the State of the Humanitarian Shelter and Settlements Report for the Global Shelter Cluster. It runs to 300 pages. You won't see a single picture of a shelter in there. The point is it's about people who live in them and how you do it as a process. And we could talk on another day about that. But I just want to show this one example from here, just to summarize, that it's about process and engagement, not only the product. Obviously, the product's useful because you keep trying more. This is a tent on the top right given by a well-meaning but deluded charity, in my opinion, and I think the evidence says that, where you give this Norwegian tent, costs about $1,200. Once you ship it and buy it, it's the best tent in the world. It's brilliant. And this is after Typhoon Haiyan and Tacloban. What are you going to do with that? You're stuck in relief forever. Relief is the enemy of recovery. Well-intended, totally deluded, total waste of money. You walk 100 meters down the road, because this is a stand-up row with these people. Down here, $500, this house is being built using local materials with local builders who are being paid locally, and when it's finished, it'll have a veranda for 5/12 the cost of the tent. And this happens all the time. Well-intended, totally misguided. Great. Okay, number 5, have the right skills. I'm going to just do this very quickly. Yeah, it's just having the right people doing the right thing, and I'm just going to skip that one because it's kind of obvious. I want to jump to this one. It's about developing relationships. Obviously, the whole world works on trusted relationships, but the power imbalances are massive if you're in a poor country or a middle-income country, or even that, or whatever, and then the aid people come. There's the whole critique of that, what they called the Laws of Poverty, a very famous book about 20 years ago, so you might know it. The power imbalance is immense. So what are you going to do? How are you going to do it? There are lots of ways to do it. I don't want to dwell on this too much, but if I am convinced, well, if I've got to spend my budget, and I don't really care about you, oh helpless victim, I'm just going to force my way through, and you'll probably withdraw and say thank you and go away, and I'll go do my own thing. But if you spend time doing consensus and accommodating, then actually that's the point. And that's where aid works. Because it's about dignity and respect and ownership. It's not the savior mentality, and the savior stuff does a lot of harm. It's all about that stuff, which in another planet is known as mainstream development, actually, in recovery. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, one example of that. But I thought I'd just jump around a bit. This is some current work taking place in Australia, which is kind of urban, but urbanish. And it's this idea of building relationships. So I'm working with some councils on developing community resilience plans. And so we've been having a lot of listening. This is one of 5 meetings we had just the other week, 8th of March in Gundillion, where we had a small number of people. And over 5 different nights, over 2 visits, we just did a lot of listening. This is the council, we're coming to listen, which is just as well, because in this meeting, one woman got up and said, this is a farce. The whole thing's a farce. It's a conspiracy. It wasn't. Generally, listening, engaging, because it doesn't matter if no one wants David's resilience plan. It's a locally owned plan. So the draft, you're the first to see it. It's actually going to go out in a couple of weeks' time. And what we're thinking is this would be a resilience plan. Resilience being stronger and more prepared for disasters. Shortest definition ever of resilience. And after listening to all these different people, 5 groups, about 100 people, all this stuff, we've come down to this idea. It's about local bonds, call it social capital. It's about local actions. It's not me. It's empowerment and ownership. It's about information, being timely on information. And it's about including everybody. That's deliberately taken from the Leave No One Behind rhetoric, good rhetoric from the Red Cross and the military, I think, originally. And then infrastructure as well, of course. So our resilience plan, our community resilience plan, is based on building relationships and from that local ownership around these 5 things. And I'll let you know how it goes. It's easy to say, hard to do. But it's all about local ownership. If there's no local ownership, forget it. Honestly, just forget it. Number 7, be flexible. Uncertainty and rapid change is the definition of a city. Of course, if you were in Kathmandu and it's shaking all the time through earthquakes, or in another city or whatever it may be, uncertainty. And the AID system is caricatured by the most inflexible project cycle management tools you've ever seen on planet Earth, or the logical framework analysis, which is great, but when it becomes a contract, it's dead. And it's a living document, and when it's misused. So anyway, so the book tried to gather a lot of those things. User journey, the adaptiveness cycle, which is very simple. Again, it's not rocket science. Adaptive management, it's been around for a while. How you work, how you're flexible. But some of these phrases from development, employing optimal ignorance, it's a very liberating phrase to be optimally ignorant. How little do I need to know? I don't need to know everything. Starting points to end states, that's taken straight from what's called action planning methodology, championed by Nabil Hamdi and others. But actually having approaches being flexible and nimble, which aid agencies and donor funding absolutely are not and is not. But it's changing, it's changing. There's no choice but to change because we're living in a rapidly urbanizing world, as we know. This is number 8, taking time to listen, more of that actually, understanding the context and forms of assessment, and that actually means using assessment tools. Kobo Toolbox you might be using or knowing. It's a Harvard one, it's very simple, it's an assessment thing on your phone or whatever, gathering and it's uploaded, it's super fast. But assessments, people say, well, there's no time for assessments in a disaster. Well, there's obviously the immediate life saving of literally pulling people out of the rubble or something like that, obviously. But if you don't do assessments straight away, as soon as you can, forget it because you don't know what you're doing. And it's not just what I think. This was a big piece of research championed by Mary Anderson about 10 years ago now. And they interviewed, it's 4,000 or 5,000 people around the world, people like you and I caught up in disasters in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Europe, and saying, what was your experience of aid? And a lot of it was great, thank you very much. This is not a hatchet job on aid. A lot of it is really, really, really good. But one of the biggest challenges is not listening well enough. Few people call for more aid. They just want smarter aid, too much given too fast. And Mary called the thing time to listen as a wake-up call to the aid world 10 years ago to say we need to listen harder, actually. And so these are probably the most important bit of your humanitarian kit if we were doing a training. Absolutely the case. This is freely available online and it's a powerful read. Okay, and then something a couple of us did that came out at the end of last year, using the Sphere standards in urban settings. The Sphere project came out at the end of the 90s. It's the 15 big agencies, aid agencies, without MSF. They, for their own reasons, choose not to be part of it. Are saying what are minimum standards for response? What's the minimum amount of space in a building? How close do you need? How far away can a water point be? All these things. Quite controversial because obviously the world is very varied. But you know what? It's a genuine, heartfelt attempt to get it right. So, so this was just launched in October and it's available online. Take a look, and it's actually based on the Good Practice Review. And just this picture on the right from Sierra Leone, just a stakeholder analysis, you're mapping who does what. And I just put that up to say that, to show the very quick complexity. This is during the Ebola crisis, about 5 years ago that it struck West Africa and Liberia as well, and Guinea. Already you're trying to map the actors and who's doing what. How do you quickly do that without being paralyzed? So the Sphere guide is out there and it's interpreting the Sphere project, which is this fact, with an urban lens. Okay, number 9, I'm trotting through this because I promised it's going to be about 30 minutes. Locally driven recovery, of course, because whose disaster is it? It's not mine, I come and go, or yours if you're 8 people coming and going. It's people who are there locally. And I just want to talk about this a little bit, area-based approaches. And area-based approaches are about putting people in the middle, and I rather cheekily put up the cluster diagram here. Who's in the center of the diagram? It's the emergency relief coordinator. There's a risk of arrogance about that. Maybe that's a bit of a cheap pop at a graphic, but actually it plays out. You need a lot of people who are very, I'm in charge kind of thing. Put people in the middle, put sectors around to support, and then scale up where you can. And that's a deliberately simple diagram. I was going to show you one with 10 principles, very complex language. I'd bore you all to death. But the summary is people-centered approaches called area-based approaches. And we've been doing a little bit of work, actually, some of us with ANU at the Pacific Security College. And these were, in fact, they were released 5 days ago. They came out at the beginning of this week. We hired, with ANU's money, thank you very much, ANU, we hired researchers, national researchers in Solomon Islands, Fiji, and Vanuatu. And they, 3 women, and they each undertook an analysis of what does an area-based approach look like after a disaster recovery in each of these countries. So you're people-centered, you're participatory, you're collaborative, you're engaging. ABAs are really hard to do. They're really hard to do, but that's the point, because recovery is difficult, it's not simple. But what does it take to do those things? So those reports are out, and they're also on the IGD website. Please take a look. They're literally 5 days old, and the census report is in the middle. But we did find, a lot of people are doing amazing stuff. It's complicated, it's hard, it's going to get harder. The threats of climate change, as we're knowing, to Pacific countries are literally existential. Existential. Again, the IPCC report from 2019, the worst case scenario by 2050 is the once every century storms will be annual. And there's a thing about frequency of once a century, but it's really serious. That's worst case, but heaven forbid. So we're talking about more disasters taking place there. And we call it Whose Disaster Is It? Again, about localizing recovery in the Pacific. And then finally, number 10 is to take the long view. Relief is the enemy of recovery. Recovery may last for decades, build resilience from day one. All these things are easy to say, but there are examples of it. I just want to end with one example, which again, just to be sort of timely, I suppose, and there's nothing worse than showing research from 10 years ago. It really shows it. Just something from last week, actually, this time last week. So I've been doing some work with a council, another council, down in Beaver Vale, and we had a workshop this time last week, last Friday. And they called it the Recovery to Resilience Workshop. And we had 20 people in the room who were chairs of the local recovery association. And what's the conversation about Australia in 2050? And how are we going to get there? So how are we going to shift from single hazard, if you like, to resilient multi-hazards in the context of climate change? So we looked at the Royal Commission report, which is strong. Take a look, it's 500 pages. And there are other commissions from the bushfire. Just one quote: Australia's disaster outlook is alarming. This is a political document that's, careful. Australia's climate expected to change: high average temperatures, shifting rain patterns, increasing number and severity of extreme weather, and a rise in the number of days above 35 degrees C by 2050, which, Chris, I think will be, forget it, but, you'll still be here, something like that.
Maybe
it's just
not.
around. So what?
Maybe not in the basement.
Yeah. That's not what I heard. Yeah, but it's being serious about resilience. And these people were amazing. They were on fire. So we did a half-day workshop. We did scenario planning. Do you know story? Yep, you do scenario planning, where you imagine alternate futures. And there are usually 2 drivers. There are quadrants. And so everybody really answered the spirit. This guy's the head of Resilience New South Wales for this region. All these people, he's the council guy, the head of the council, she's sitting there. They're quite serious people. How should we futurescape and from that work backwards? So we did all that kind of stuff. It's very powerful. We did it in 4 hours. And just to show you what we came out with, what they came out with. So this was the scenario plan, the 2 drivers. And there's no point putting no climate change. It's here. That's a standard. The issue is, what are you going to do? So reactive to proactive, and this is for local government, but rest New South Wales, there and others. So you don't really do much. You respond to every disaster, or you get ahead of the curve and proactive. The bottom here, single hazard, low impact. They do happen, but we are moving to that, and multi-hazard, high impact. This council's just had its 5th flood, and then the bushfires last year. That's incredible. It's just, and this is the country that's wealthy, so, it's really serious stuff. So, as you may know, in scenario planning, you come out with as dramatic titles as you can. Yep. Okay, so they came out with these.
Where's your utopian vision?
Well, the utopian, the best one is you're proactive. Yeah, this is the best case, right?
Utopia.
Yeah, you're ahead of the curve, you don't have many. The dystopia, which always comes into scenarios, right? The word dystopia, preferably alliterative with dystopia, which is good. So we got that. So the dystopian, reactive, high impact, dystopian to begin. Frankly, that's where we're headed, and that's where a lot of countries around the world are headed, including my own, UK and others. That's if we don't change and get more agile. The word agile you hear again and again about people being agile and proactive. Rather wonderfully, the head of the council was on this one, Bigger Runs the World, which is just great. A showcase of perfection. And then this was a great time. We the people, you're proactive again. You can deal with it. But theirs was, it's all about community ownership. That's why it's we the people. They really, that was them, not anybody else. And then that was powerfully built. We missed the boat. We were too late. Okay? So that resilience idea, and it was great. I mean, they're literally meeting on Monday to discuss this, about what happens next. But this is what we did last Friday, about how do you think about those things. And that is it. I just try hard not to ramble on or get stuck in stuff. So these are the 10 takeaways. This is actually, I won't show you it. Take a look online if you want to. It's a 4-minute animation, with the quick hand draw. It's really, really good. It was, we commissioned it in the US. Anyway, these are the 10 takeaways. You won't find the 10 takeaways in this, by the way. This was trying to get the overview of the big shapes. Yeah, and go to the end and find the answer. But that's it, actually. I want to stop there because it is 4:30 on a Friday. Great time. Your questions online. Do we have time for any conversation, or we can wrap up?
We got like a lot of time. Yeah, plenty of time for conversation. Yeah, thank you very much, David.
It's a pleasure.
And so we will start the conversation from online.
Oh, great.
So either people can pop the questions up in the chat or unmute yourself and ask away. Yeah.
Great.
I officially open the floor.
While there's questions coming online, I really like it, bringing it local. I mean, it's fantastic, and obviously this is globally significant as an issue. But with having your spot, that diagram you have of the 5 spheres, where 3 of them were people related, and they were all in the middle.
Yeah.
I really like that, and information and the infrastructure on the side. I mean, I guess if you look at traditional sort of city planning, we talk about people, but we do struggle a lot with putting people in the centre.
Yeah. No, it was an interesting one that we that ABA one, but also the council one. That was for another council. I better mention their name because it's not been released yet. This is the work in progress. But the idea is very much ownership. I mean, we all know resilience. We breathe it, did PhDs and everything else. We could write a 300-page thing about here's your resilience plan, and nobody will use it. And that's that. But if you weave it into everyday life, if you're serious about it, then it's all about that stuff. It's negotiation and communication.
Stephen from online class.
Oh, hi, Stephen.
Hey, David, how are you
Good to
going?
see you. Yeah, good to see you. Hi.
Yeah, well, I can't quite see you. All I can see is a little kind of dark shadow and lurking on your PowerPoint. Look, I've you know that my kind of interest is in human capital and the way in which we can actually sort of map human capital within a certain situation, event, or sort of calamity, especially in terms of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But if it's if your argument is something like resilience is kind of process oriented, if risk analysis is actually processual as opposed to something that you can identify, how do you come in? Well, I suppose how do you harness, or even how do you visualize the kind of potential mobilization of human capital in a very particular local and event specific kind of situation, where many of the markers or many of the criteria to evaluate this is not something that is written in the kind of policy statements or even in the way in which the criteria for aid is kind of dished out, right? Yeah. So because these are local specific, highly networked, interrelations between people whose immediate action or whose what they can do in that particular situation is not directly attributable to solving the problem of, let's say, whether it's water or sanitation, but in fact it's kind of almost local knowledge and local bonds that because of their networks, because of their social and cultural networks, are able to then harness, the capacity of others, within that situation. So this is very difficult to actually sort of map out, especially when one has to plan, because this is the way in which, you need a plan, otherwise it can't be funded, right? So how do you deal with that in this situation?
Cool. Well, as you say, no, it's all about that, hey? Human capital, social capital, that bridging, the bonding, and all that stuff. And the holy grail for any interventions are to tap into that and then fade into the background, which sometimes happen and often doesn't. If we had more time, I'd try and pack the area-based approach stuff, and I've done a bit of work on that, and there are a couple of reports on that and projects and things, and it takes up a chunk of this good practice review. That relies all about engaging and working with locals, with local people, and connecting with them. I don't think there are any magic answers to that, but I think a lot of it is about relationships. It's obviously about, well, obviously it's relationships, obviously it's power, devolving funding. So funding is more localized. I was part of a project, this is 20 years ago in Zambia, and we worked with local councils, and money was devolved to local councils. And it wasn't a lot, it's £1 million, but not a tiny amount. But the idea was, how do you get money to people locally? So the ownership is there, because the systems are not set up for that. The big 8 systems are not set up for it. And so Ndoga Council in Zambia took that project on. Actually, just a slide aside, 9 months into the project, we're having a conversation with the project people there in the council. They said, this is all great, thank you very much, and they're wonderful. Then they said, we've not been paid in 6 months ourselves. That's the reality, that's the reality. The reality is so much is just, so, in a lot of places, doing anything is something, and building on that.
Yeah, I think it's really quite difficult to justify, I suppose, if you're kind of writing a project plan, for A to go, to a certain cause or area, and we know that we need to kind of fund sort of activities or projects that that actually bring people together, right?
Yes.
Like for example, you mentioned working with women within an area specific sort of project, because their know-how and their expertise is not technical expertise, but in fact it's very much part of their kind of care economy network, right? Yeah. So to fund a project, let's say to do with disaster relief, but then getting the money channeled into the gathering of communities. Maybe it is through food, or maybe it's through, through a kind of, I suppose activities that actually happen that are run, mostly by women. Yeah. That's where the human capital can actually sort of start to emerge, right? And we can start to see the shape of possibilities, when we actually do get a whole community together, right?
Absolutely. And as you know, the whole village savings and loan schemes and Grameen Bank, famously from Bangladesh, it's not about money, it's about relationships. It's about trust. You get a group, it's usually 7 or 8 people. It's almost always women. It's based on trust. It's not based on money. And that's why it works. Is that, and I suppose that reinforces the argument of this thing, that good recovery is actually developmental. It's less of the the fire brigades, important as they are actually and needed.
Yeah, I think the mapping of trust is something so fundamental to trust relations. Is so fundamental to getting a picture of the human capital of of a particular place.
Totally, couldn't agree more. Thank you. Great. Any other questions? Yeah. Hey, no, you'll have to fight it out.
I'll go first, because you were just talking about trust, and I wanted to ask a question about the dark underbelly, I guess. So really great presentation. You talked about flexibility, you talked about using money, you talked about being, I can't remember the word, but
nimble.
Not knowing more than you need to know.
Optimal ignorance.
Optimal ignorance, right? And all of that was making me think, well, what about the situation where people are being exploited or where crime is occurring, right? People are taking advantage of that flexibility to take things off others in the community, or to come in from outside and take from the community that's receiving financial aid. I would expect your response would be that the community would be involved in managing and policing that, but what's the role of humanitarian aid in supporting the community to police that crime or that potential crime?
That's a great question, and my first thought is protection is really huge, and it's grown in recent years, for all the right reasons. So after the Nepal earthquake, immediately there's trafficking going on the border. That's immediate. It's an opportunity to do trafficking because the borders are released. And already, I remember I was at the meeting this time last year, when COVID was kicking off, a paradise for corruption, because you make the rules softer, speeder. In the UK right now, you see the Prime Minister's up against the wall because giving out stuff too quickly without due diligence. I know that's not what you're asking, but you know, when disasters happen, yes, bad people exploit them, and that's absolutely the case. So the protection cluster, and it cuts across, there's a gigantic amount of work going into that and gone into that, about how you can apply protection principles throughout, especially for women and girls. I'm not sure that's probably an answer. That sounded a bit weak from my response. If I may say so myself.
I guess I don't really know where it sits in your 10 things, where the protection sits in your.
Oh, right.
10
This
things
is
to
the
know.
world's biggest overview. Please read the protection chapter. There is one.
Well,
I'll
thanks.
give you right there.
I'm gonna.
It's yeah. No, this was.
I'm gonna come for a drink, so
briefest summary
I'll
in the
speak
world.
to you about it
Okay,
more.
good.
First of all, that was a really, really great presentation. Thank you. But interesting. So I did development studies as my major, and not once, I would say, in my entire degree was urban development really talked about. It was all, you know, parts of
Do you know
Africa.
why? Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
It's because rich people live in cities. Poverty is rural.
Yeah.
And for decades. It's actually, sorry to interrupt you, just to say, then that's based on how you measure it. If you need to use money to live in a city, you're going to have money compared to the countryside. But sorry, go ahead.
But-
Big cock up for decades.
Yeah, no, it's, yeah, exactly. But my question is essentially, so in development, you always see more disenfranchised or low SES groups kind of left out of the conversation. How are these like more vulnerable groups in your experience being included in kind of resilience planning?
Difficultly, in a difficult manner. Yeah, absolutely, and in a very imperfect way. Any good assessment, of course, makes a beeline, as you're knowing, to the most vulnerable. And often it doesn't happen, and it may be for all kind of reasons. I was doing a workshop we were doing, it's called Participatory Rapid Appraisal, PRA. Yep, we were doing some PRA stuff. I used to run workshops. And we were in India, and are you from India? You're whereabouts, man?
Tamil Nadu.
Oh, we used to go to Bhubaneswar and do stuff down there. Great. So anyway, so we were working in a place for several days in a village, and then somebody said that, yeah, and the community over there, we said, what community? And it was, as you know, it was a different caste community just next door. Nobody mentioned, not because people were evil or bad or anything, it's just not on the radar, you know, it's not a criticism, it's just an observation. You know, it's a different thing. You know, and it's hard, even now working with some of the council stuff, you know, we need to go to Aboriginal land councils, and you know, that's because at none of those meetings we've had were Aboriginal people there. And we know that. So there's a starting place, but not the end state. Yeah, it's too often missed off, but there's a heartfelt effort, but too often it's missed off, as you know.
There's another question about participation in the chat.
Ripon. Shall I read that? Participation is key to resilience planning, but literature reflects a little evidence on that. Would you please share more about the real-world challenges affecting community engagement into such planning? Yeah, well, really, the conversation we just had there, that, you know, it's easy to say and really hard to do, hey? It depends on you. Here's the, you know, that diagram I showed, if you force your way through, personally, I think that's the key to so many things on planet Earth. And again, it's not trying to be romanticizing that, you know, we listen to everybody, engage everybody, because that ain't gonna happen. But so much is about how we listen and engage, and the choices we have. The choices, and this was developed by a fellow called Simon Fisher. He ran an NGO called Responding to Conflict for decades, and he really knows. He would go talk to really, really tough people about these things. A Quaker fellow, Simon. And so we all have a choice. But if you've got to spend lots of money or get coverage, or you're time bound as projects, as you're alluding to, Stephen, and others, you know, the temptation is to force. You force, I withdraw. Also, how you're measured. If the shelter cluster sector is measured by the number of houses you build, no, you know, that's an input. That's not an output. That's not an outcome. That's not impact. So that's the problem, how you're measured. You know, the systems are not deliberately meant to be evil. I mean, you know, but they conspire to do the wrong thing. They encourage the idea that you force through what you want to do. And that's a real problem, especially in the urban space, because you ain't going to fix it. I mean, there's a lot I've not touched on. There's a whole bit about, you know, an assumption you're going to go after a disaster and fix it. No, you're not. No, you're not. You can do something. After Typhoon Haiyan, as good as it got was to help half the people when it came to shelter. And that was thought to be really good, and it was really good, actually, to meet half the needs. It's not going to be fixed, especially in urban areas where there's grinding poverty already. I mentioned the sphere standards. They talk about standards. I was in a meeting a long time ago in Niger, and there was a food crisis, 2003, and we're all around at the table applying the sphere standards after a disaster. And the sphere standards say the amount of food you need, the amount of blah, and we all sat there and one person said, well, that's great. That already cuts out 85% of the people in Niger who are already poorer than that anyway before the disaster. So, you know, there's no simple answers here. So sorry, Ripane, I'm jumping around too much. But yeah, it is absolutely key because it's whose plan is it? And that's what we've been trying to do in this particular council in the South. It's not David's plan. I mean, David can give you a plan, but there's no point to that because there's no ownership. It's all about local ownership.
But David, on that, just because my experience of doing the scenario planning exercises in Australia is that you have 20 people in the room, maybe 15 of them are from council, and there might be a few smattering of, you know, sort of stakeholder groups. And yeah, okay, so that's the council.
Yeah.
By default, that's
That's a different council.
Is that, but that one that you just showed in Bega, how
It's a different
many?
council.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
One of those ones that you got that
Yeah,
image of, you know, what percentage are you finding of the community you actually, like, just your standard sort of farmer or shop owner or, you know,
So these ones.
turning up?
Yeah, sorry, I was probably a bit confusing. The bigger one was for council as a one-off. This is a 2-year piece of work in Queanbeyan.
Okay.
Queanbeyan Panorama, Terry campaigns. So yeah, this is all about.
So this is the actual community.
Yeah, so we had 5 meetings. We had so we had about 45 people in this one in Braidwood, and then we had a series of other meetings. And please come, but of course a lot of people don't come, right? So this is the starting point, not the end state. So in the next month, we had a meeting 3 days ago. We identified all the different groups. Top of the list, Aboriginal Land Council, business owners. I mean, it was every single person who came. Thank you very much. The demographic, it was all white. I was probably the youngest person in the room at 55. But thank you for coming. That's not a criticism of those who came. You know, thank you for coming. You know? So that's great. So the next thing now is younger people and kids. We're going to hopefully go to schools and do some fun activities about, if you're 14 years old, what's a plan? We're not going to terrify people, but what's a plan? Have a lot of fun. You know, everybody knows Floods and Fires, sadly, because you know, you're surrounded by it. Have a lot of fun with that. You know, don't trust anybody over 14, right? That's what the people say. So yeah, so we're deliberately going to do that. And it's lots of cups of coffee and lots of cups of tea and lots of things like that. Yeah. And we'll see where it takes us.
Do you have any active strategies you employ? I mean, it's very good to listen, but obviously it's impossible to be outside your own head to the extent of living the experience of someone else is a fundamental barrier there. And so you could gather all this information and interpret it through your own lens, however that gets condensed. Are there any strategies you employ to actively try to reduce your own bias and your own lens on that information as much as possible?
Coffee. That's a really good question. Sorry, I didn't mean to be. I think by saying
I was trying to. I'm sure there are official terms to.
No, I'm with you. And the PRA we were talking about just a minute ago, Patisserie Rapid Appraisal was developed 40 years ago, 50 years ago, Robert Chambers, the rest, and championed around the world.
Yes.
But a way to really try and offset bias. I mean, I question myself a lot. I mean, I'm developing a community-owned plan and I don't live there. So what is my role? But I think I come full circle to say, as an outsider, you can be neutral and objective. Actually, it was very funny. At the Bega meeting last Friday, Chris, the guy who's running it, he said, there's about 20 of us in the room, they're all busy. And then someone said, I'll take a photo. And Chris said, no, well, let's get David to do that. And he said, respectfully, David is the only person in the room whose opinion doesn't matter, which is really quite nice. So I'm not making the point of being the outsider about somebody who can just pull together. So this thing we're doing right now, we sought to do this thing. We got about 20 pages of quotes. We wrote down everything everybody wrote, faithfully and totally. All these things we wrote down. We didn't throw anything out. And then we gathered an awful lot of the quotes. And then it was me, I've got to tell you. We thought, how do you make it simple and clear and obvious, but backed up by the quotes? And this was the best attempt. And so that will go out for consultation, and it's a two-sider. And each bit's backed up the quotes, and it's, why are we wrong? Please tell us, how can this be improved? More to then bounce off, so we're going to take this around all the different groups. But yeah, offsetting bias. Yeah, I completely take your point.
Yeah. I have one. So for example, so this is coming from my experience in Delhi.
Hmm.
So I've lived in Delhi for like 7 years. I have the opinion that like Delhi is in a constant phase of disaster. Like so basically like every year, every season, it's just disaster after disaster. So it's like there is no normal to that situation at all. So how does like the response for a city like that? So it's like except Diwali comes in, it's smoke everywhere, and then the winter goes away, there is malaria like outbreak, and then you have a dengue outbreak, and so the response is like continuous and like never ending. So
And 50 degrees as well.
yeah, so summer comes in and like the stuff. So it's been going on for like the past 15 years. I've known Delhi like it's like a constant disaster. So how does like the framework of where does
I don't want to be a pessimist, I've got to tell you, but yeah, a place like Delhi, which is extraordinary and wonderful. I've been going since the early 90s. I mean, I first went, there were no bridges, not one bridge, not one overpass. It's incredible. Then they were built in the late 90s. Boom,
Yeah.
70 them immediately. It was incredible. But yeah, I mean, you know, all the pollution that takes place as well, which is endless. They tried to get rid of the compressed gas. They got rid of the tuk-tuks that had about 20 years ago. It was a right of information or whatever, RTI, whatever it's called. And then they were replaced by gas. And they shut down all the factories, right? In Delhi as well. So there are the efforts. I mean, you've got a great government. You've got an amazingly stable democracy, which is not perfect, just like everybody's, including UK elsewhere. I've got no answers to you. I mean, geez, I mean, that's seriously bad. My closest friend, he lives there. He's a Delhiite, lived there his entire life. We collaborate together a lot. He has an NGO called Seeds India. And he posted on LinkedIn about, Andrew Sharma.
So yeah.
Well, he posted on LinkedIn about 3 hours ago saying, we don't learn. Look at it, we don't learn. No, he's on Twitter. He did a paper and the thing, and we don't learn. We're really, we're really bad at learning. Everybody. We don't seem to get it. We're reactive. We're solving the last disaster.
Yeah. So like on a completely separate note, like so for example, another thing is like so cities in the last like 5-10 years have invested so much in urban informatics, like data infrastructure. How has that helped in the response, like in the last 5 years in your experience?
Oh, you're asking the wrong person. I don't know anything that's black box to me. I can only speculate massively. And the only reason I say that is Pam, my wife, works in New South Wales. And so she's often based at Olympic Park, you know, that great big, amazing room that they have. I mean, of course, that's a good thing. Yeah. I mean, what do you think? I'm sure you've got a view on this.
I don't know actually. So I'm like it's both. Like sometimes I see that like it's a very good investment in terms of in disasters, but I don't see that. Like, for example, right now the COVID situation in Delhi, I don't see any smart city investment paying off in terms of information data now. So it's mostly like the community stuff. Like so, I see like most of the information in terms of beds, the hospital beds available. Those are not coming from investments in smart cities. So that's my experience at least.
No, it's a terrible situation right now.
But isn't that a reflection? I mean, you're across this sector and, you know, if you're not across, there's 5 sort of really good examples of how data or maps and sensors or whatever, you know, that, I mean, maybe it just is a big gap in many parts of the world.
And there's a lot of work going on, as you know, with Ian. I mean, coming out with dashboards and the rest and stuff, they're incredibly helpful. So there is a lot of information about it and getting better. An awful lot of mapping is taking place. There's a fellow who's called Patrick, I forget his last name, someone on the call might know it, who's really championed, do you know digital humanitarianism? And I'm sure that's the wrong phrase, the last 10 years. It was really hating the Kenya elections just before the 88 earthquake, where a lot of stuff was really developed actually in this space, in the humanitarian space. So there is a lot on it, but I'm just not up to speed on it.
We'll keep you in the basement a bit longer.
Yes, please.
We'll try.
Every time we meet for coffee, say there's got to be a virtuous Venn diagram.
We'll have to have one to your slide deck.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
It's a task for us over a beer.
Oh, yes, please.
Any other questions from online before we? I think like okay. Yeah. I think we're. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you everyone for coming to the seminar today. And we had around like maybe 22 people for attending here, so that's good turnout. And thanks, David, for the.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for listening.
Someone's waiting in the lobby. I think they just.
Yeah, as usual, like we're gonna break the drinks. White House has unfortunately
Shut down.
Shut down.
So
So
around.
we're gonna go to the roundhouse. Like usually it's like a bit loud around this time, so we're gonna. Yeah.
We'll have to shut. Thank you for joining us online very much. Thank you.
No problem. Sit, David.
Thank you. See you soon. Bye. Okay.
Thanks.
Always a pleasure. There is a protection sector in there, isn't it? I'm just like, where is it going? Looking where